Welcome to this rapid revision exam skills session looking at paper 2, the British Depth Study question 1b, explain. This is a 12-mark question. I'm going to be focusing on Anglo-Saxon and Norman England as that's what I teach, but many of the tips on technique and the mark scheme will be applicable to other topics too. Let's get a bit of background about the Pearson Edexcel Paper 2. Traditionally this is split in two. One is a British depth study and the other is a European or wider world depth study. The topic that I teach is Anglo-Saxon and Norman England circa 1060 to circa 1087 and the American West 1830 to 1895 for the wider world depth study. In the past these two have been provided with as separate booklets answered within the same exam. For the year 2022 only though, these exams have been split into two separate shorter exams, so just be mindful of that. Traditionally though, the total time for both papers is 1 hour and 45 minutes. You can half that in 2022 as they will be sat separately. Now let's have a look at the question. Let's pay some attention first of all to the instructions that are included in the exam paper and the question that we're going to be going over. The first instruction to take note of is this one here. It tells you how many questions that you need to answer, so make sure you don't answer too few or indeed too many. You must answer question 1a. This is the 4 marks, describe 2 features of question. Then you must answer question 1b, and you won't be given a choice on this. That's the question that we've got below here as an example. And then for the long 16 mark question, question 1c, you got 2 options that you can choose from there. So obviously you'll be able to choose the one that you're strongest on. But for this video, we're going to be focusing on question 1b. Here we've got the example. Explain why there was a succession crisis after the death of Edward the Confessor. This is taken from the 2019 exam paper. With this particular type of question, you are given some stimulus points to help you along. These are examples that you may use within the answer. So that's our next instruction. Have a look at it now. This is a 12-mark answer, so that gives you an indication as to how long you should spend on this question and how much you should write. And the question is saying that you may use the following in your answer, the Witten and William of Normandy. And by saying that you may use that, it means that you don't have to, but it's probably a good idea to because you know that those examples are relevant. To get full marks in this question though, you must also use information of your own. If you don't do this, you're limited to an absolute maximum of 8 marks, even if the rest of your answer is really good. So let's see what is required here. This is going to be a question where you are having to explain why there was a succession crisis after the death of Edward the Confessor. So explaining why there was a succession crisis is the key issue here. You're looking at causation. For this question, you will need to explain how examples that you know led to a succession crisis. Here, half of your marks, 6 marks, are going to be about your analysis of second order concepts. In this case, causation, why things happened. This is also known as assessment objective 2. Assessment objective 1 is your knowledge and understanding of features and characteristics. In other words, how much do you know about the topic that's relevant. You should include enough examples, 3 is probably sufficient, and include a brief conclusion explaining the most important reason or the overall theme as to why there was a succession crisis. You should aim to spend about 18 minutes on this question. You might spend a little bit longer, you might spend a little bit less, but unless you're entitled to extra time, that's about it. So let's have a look at how you might approach this question. First of all, you've got space at the top there to write down any extra examples that you might want to include. So typically you might want to include a section on the Witten and how that was relevant to the succession crisis, William of Normandy, how he was relevant to a succession crisis, and one of your own examples as well. This is how it would look on the page. Notice that you've got lines underneath to write your answer. We'll come back to that in a moment. You'll have a lot more lines than that. Don't worry about that. There'll be plenty of space. Here's the mark scheme that the examiner will be working from. I've left out levels 1 and 2 because we're going to be aiming rather higher than that. And I realise that these are written in the examiner's jargon, but we're going to look at some of the differences in the language here so that we can see what is the difference between a good answer, which is level 3, and a really good answer, which is level 4. In level 3 it says an explanation is given, showing some analysis which is mainly directed at the conceptual focus of the question. But compare that to level 4. An analytical explanation is given which is directed consistently at the conceptual focus of the question. So it's really important for level 4 that you are not only consistent but you're really to the point and you don't deviate away to other issues. You keep it focused on the question. Why was there a succession crisis? What else then? It's shown as a line of reasoning which is generally sustained, although some passages may lack coherence and organisation. That means that your answer may be a little bit clunky, it might not be ordered in quite the right way, maybe you don't look at things in a particular sequence. Compare that to level 4. Here, the line of reasoning, your argument, your opinions, is coherent, sustained and logically structured. You don't change your mind halfway through, for example. But what about AO1, the knowledge? Level 3 refers to accurate and relevant information, showing good knowledge. So basically you won't make many mistakes in terms of your accurate knowledge. Whereas level 4 looks at relevant information being precisely selected. In other words, you're choosing the very best examples for supporting your answer, and also showing a wide-ranging knowledge, not just a good knowledge, but a really, really good knowledge, wide-ranging. Here's another important point though. As I've said earlier, you are limited to a maximum of 8 marks for level 3 answers that don't go beyond the Witten and William of Normandy. So make sure you put in some of your own knowledge too. Otherwise, you're not going to get more than 8, and you certainly can't access level 4. So let's see how you might approach answering this question. First of all, you might want to pause the question here and have a go at the answer yourself. Put on a stopwatch or timer for 18 minutes and see what you can produce in that time. If not, I'm going to give you some examples of how you might approach the question. With my students, we talk about using point, example, explain and link to help structure our answer. You don't have to do this, but it is a good way sometimes if you're a little bit less confident in structuring your work of making sure that you're including enough analysis along with your examples. So let's see how it can be used. Firstly, the point. One reason there was a succession crisis was the Wittens' decision to appoint Harold Godwinson as king after Edward's death. Harold was a wealthy and popular earl who had shown his power and leadership in dealing with the rising against his brother Tostig in 1065. The Witten had an important say in appointing the next king, and by supporting Harold they were showing that he had the support of the English nobility in defending England from Norman and Viking invasion. However, this also shows that Harold's claim was not uncontested. This led to a succession crisis, as although the Witten supported Harold, he had no blood relationship with Edward and he did not have the only claim to the throne, leaving his opponent as king open to being contested by other claimants such as William of Normandy and Harold Hardrada. And that's where I've really linked it back to the question, saying why this fact about the Witten and about Harold Godwinson leads to a succession crisis. That's where we're looking at causation. So I get some credit for AO2 for the first bit there, because I'm saying why the Witten led to a succession crisis, or rather their decision. I then support it with some of my own knowledge. That's AO1, knowledge. There's a mixture in the next bit. I'm including my own knowledge, but I'm also explaining why that might contribute to a succession crisis, and then I really fully link it back to the question, explaining why there was a succession crisis in the last bit, the link sentence. Notice at the start of this, I make it really clear to any examiner that's reading this. This led to a succession crisis, and that's kind of parroting back part of the question. One of the tips I can give you here is that when this particular question was set for real, some students who had good knowledge but not good explanation simply went through the 4 main claimants to the throne. They explained what their claims were, how strong they were, but didn't take it any further than that. They were limiting themselves to level 2 or level 3 with that because it was lacking that coherence and laser sharp accuracy explaining why that was a succession crisis. So to say that Harold Godwinson had a strong claim is fine, but how does him having a strong claim actually lead to a succession crisis? That's the difference in levels here. Okay, I'm not boasting here, but I do have a degree in history, so while I'm not saying that that previous paragraph was necessarily perfect, it is my attempt to write in a realistic way as you might find in a GCSE answer. But let's have a look at a less good example now. Again, we're going to use point, example, explain and link, but it's not going to be so successful. Try and work out why. One claimant to the throne was William of Normandy. William claimed to have been offered the crown, and he also claimed that Harold Godwinson swore an oath to support him during Harold's embassy. Harold may have promised this under some duress, as he was effectively a hostage of William in 1064. This meant that William planned to invade England and take the crown from Harold Godwinson by force. So do I get any credit for this? Well, yes, there's a bit of relevant knowledge here, because knowing about the controversy between William and Harold is an important reason as to why there was a succession crisis, but it's only really AO1 here. I'm not explaining it very well in relation to the question. The point, though, is pretty well irrelevant. Yes, one claimant to the throne is William of Normandy, but that says nothing about why there was a succession crisis. Also, this is an example from 1064. Without relating that to William's later actions and why there was a succession crisis, it's not going to pick me up much. And also, this link is again not really linked to the causes and the reason why there was a succession crisis. So although there are no factual errors in this, it's not well linked to the question saying why there was there a succession crisis after the death of Edward the Confessor. So just remember that. You might have relevant information, you might have accurate information, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Keep it relevant to the question. Once you've given enough examples, you'll want to conclude with a short summary as to what was the most important, whether there was an overall theme as to why there was a succession crisis. So let's have a look at my attempt at this. Again, I'll be bringing in some of my own knowledge here and explaining in relation to the question. Overall, the most important reason there was a succession crisis was that Edward the Confessor did not appoint a clear heir. Edward had no children, and so four main claimants competed to take the throne: Harold Godwinson, Harold Hardrada, William of Normandy, and Edgar Atheling. Some had stronger claims than others. For example, Harold Godwinson was supported by the English nobility, whereas Harold Hardrada's claim was inherited from an agreement with Canute years earlier. This was the most important reason, as there was a succession crisis, as without a clear heir, it was far more likely that conflict would erupt to settle the issue. So a bit of AO2 in terms of linking as to why there was a succession crisis because of Edward's actions, some supporting information from my own knowledge, a bit of both here, looking at the relative strength of these different competing claims, and then finally nailing it down with AO2 as to saying that the fact that there wasn't a clear heir is what results in the succession crisis. However, you could try some of these other questions. Again, you could pause the video when you see a question you want, refer to our comments on the mark scheme and the general principles we've been over, and have a go at them. So for Anglo-Saxon and Norman England, explain the role of the Earls in governing Anglo-Saxon England, your stimulus points which you may use being taxation and raising armies. Or explain how William consolidated his power in 1066, destruction of the countryside and the submission of the Earls being your stimulus points. Or explain how William defeated Hereward the Wake in 1070 and 1071, the island of Ely and the monks of Ely being your stimulus points. And lastly, explain how Lanfranc reformed the Norman church architecture and church courts being your stimulus points. If you're one of my students, you'll want to pause here because the next questions won't be relevant to what we've been studying. If you're not one of my students and you're doing one of the other topics, then please proceed. How about these examples if you're studying King Richard and King John? Explain why there were anti-Jewish pogroms 1189 to 90, money lending, and the York pogrom of 1190 being your stimulus points. Or explain why the barons rebelled against King John, war with France, and taxation being your stimulus points. If you're studying Henry VIII, try these on. Explain why Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536, Henry's desire for an heir, and religious change being your stimulus points. Explain how Cardinal Wolsey helped Henry govern England, church reform, and the Court of Star Chamber being your stimulus points. In summary then, 12-mark explain questions require detailed knowledge and precise explanation. You'll be provided with 2 stimulus points which you may use, but you will need to include examples from your own knowledge too to get full marks. You will need to explain your answer in relation to the issue raised in the question, so make sure you keep this in mind. And if it helps you, you can use point, example, explain and link to help you structure your answer. I hope that's been helpful. If it has, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. If you've got a suggestion or you need any further advice, you can pop it down in the comments below and I'll see what I can do about it. Other than that, if you've got an exam coming up, the very best of luck. Thanks for watching and goodbye.